Welcome to Global India, a cultural fusion podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lilly Padman. We are indeed fortunate to have as our guest today Tarun Basu, a veteran editor who has put together an anthology to document the rise of the small but powerful Indian diaspora in the United States. Mr. Basu heads a think tank called the Society for Policy Studies. He is also the founder director of Indo-Asian News Service, a news agency and content provider on multimedia platforms. Mr. Basu has been intimately involved with Indian diaspora affairs. Well, we have a chance to hear about the Indian diaspora and their achievements straight from the horse's mouth. Thank you, Mr. Basu, for joining us on this podcast to share with us the highlights of your book, Kamala Harris and the Rise of Indian Americans. Before we proceed further, can you give us a brief overview of the book?
The book is an attempt to put the global spotlight on the small but high-achieving Indian American community, occasioned by the appointment of Kamala Harris, of part Indian origin and very proud of her cultural roots. In fact, she's been quoted as saying, "Our classical Indian names harked back to our heritage." As the Vice President of the United States, though just 4 million strong, comprising just 1% of the population, Indian Americans have excelled and attained leadership positions in almost every area they have touched, from public affairs to entrepreneurship, medicine to academia, entertainment to social activism.
Thank you, Mr. Basu, for that concise synopsis. Just before the 2020 presidential election in the US, we at Global India Podcast did launch an episode titled Kamala Harris, a Beacon of Hope. I remember asking my guest, Professor C.P. Ravindranathan, what is your prognosis for the Biden-Harris ticket, and getting a measured response from him to the effect that, in view of the many factors involved in the electoral process, it is difficult to predict the outcome. Here we are now in 2021 with Vice President Kamala Harris, the first woman occupying the second highest position in the US government. The fact that she is of Indian and Jamaican origin makes it an even more amazing feat. The great American story conveyed by Kamala Harris resonates deeply with Indian immigrants like me and many others who went to America in the 1960s for their higher education. We ended up making America our home and bringing up our children in two cultures, adopting the best of both worlds. Kamala Harris epitomizes this fusion of cultures, and her story validates the mission of this podcast, which is to build cross-cultural bridges and not walls. I'm sure her ascendance to the vice presidency was by no means a piece of cake. Can you tell us about the behind-the-scenes story of the hard work and struggle Kamala Harris went through to get to the finish line?
Kamala Harris, from all accounts, was seen by independent political observers as a rising and driven politician from the time she became the district attorney of San Francisco. It often led to sections of media dubbing her the female Obama. In her memoirs, Harris talks about her influence of her mother, Chennai-born Shyamala Gopalan, how it was all-encompassing, and the foundational knowledge she got from her scientist, civil rights activist mother shaped her political career. President Biden, much before his election, had said of her, "You have spent your entire career fighting for folks who have been written off and left behind." And back in March 2020, when asked about Kamala Harris, Biden had said, "Look, Senator Harris has the capacity to be anything she wants to be. She is solid. She can be president one day herself. she can be vice president.
Thank you, Mr. Basu, for taking us behind the scenes to see how Kamala Harris was persistent in pursuing her goals despite many obstacles she faced along the way. What motivated you and your co authors to come together and narrate an inspiring story of how immigrants from a developing country became the most successful ethnic community in the US in terms of education and income?
It has been written before by scholars in America, but this is the first time, to the best of my knowledge, a book like this has been done from India. An anthology of 16 chapters by people who were part of the rise or associated with it or keenly followed their success stories, like I have been done for over 3 decades.
I can see how a book showcasing the rise of Indian Americans with actual examples of high achievers and how they achieved their goals would be very inspirational to the younger generation of Indian Americans growing up in America. But I also think the younger generation needs a more reliable system that can provide guidance and support for them when they need it most. In this context, I'd like to play a sound bite from the NPR All Things Considered podcast featuring student podcast challenge winner Kriti Saraf, a 16-year-old Indian American.
My honey brown skin contrasted greatly with the peachy whites and olives of my friends. My parents called me Raja and Beta, not Munchkin or Cutie Pie. When I opened up my lunchbox, I had a thermos full of dal and rice and chapati and roti, not mac and cheese or PB&J.
Kriti says the older she got, the more insecure she became about her Indian heritage, especially when her grandmother would visit Chicago from India, wearing a sari and a traditional red bindi on her forehead.
I hated the way other kids would look at my grandma and me when we went shopping. I hated the way they would ask if her bindi was a mole. I would say no, but deep down, I wanted to rip that bindi off her head and just cut off her long, thick, dark braided hair and put on a nice dress with a blue cardigan on her.
Kriti says she worried about seeming different because the world was constantly telling her she was different. She remembers being 9 when, out of the blue, a classmate told her,
"Hey, Kriti, your skin's the color of poop."
This was Kriti's initial reaction. However, eventually she was able to handle the situation brilliantly as follows.
Over time, though, she realized she'd become her own worst bully. And so she made this podcast to declare enough is enough.
It really doesn't matter what you or anyone else for that matter says to me. What matters are the words that I whisper day in and day out to myself.
This illustrates the fact that there are serious social hurdles Indian American kids need to overcome in order to bring out the best in them. Kamala Harris herself had been subjected to this type of social bias when she was growing up. Mindy Kaling has produced a Netflix series titled Never Have I Ever, depicting the traumatic experiences of an Indian American teenager. What is your take on unconscious bias in American society and its consequences? Do you have suggestions for how we can tackle this situation? For instance, would it help to expose Indian American children to Indian music and culture that would make them proud of their Indian origin?
Biases and prejudices are there in every society, particularly targeting religious, social, and ethnic minorities. Kamala Harris has fought such biases all her life. As a woman, Indian American, African American, biracial, and succeeded. Hurdles are meant to be overcome, and in the case of Indian Americans, there had to be a sense of awakening that they needed to organize themselves if they were to live with dignity in their adopted country. With one of their own as a nation's second most powerful figure, and the election of about 25 Indian Americans to national and state political representation, Indian American youth, by and large, seem quite comfortable today in their blended identities, culturally Indian but emotionally American, and see no contradiction in that. As Kamala Harris told the Washington Post in 2019, I am who I am. I am good with it. You might need to figure it out, but I am fine with it. For the US born children, Kamala Harris's journey is that of an immigrant child who navigated cultural otherness and stands today as the confident high achiever American who has not disavowed her ethnic or racial identity, noted Dr. Maina Chawla Singh, a diaspora scholar and one of the chapter authors.
Thank you, Mr. Basu, for your helpful suggestions. There is a plethora of Hindu temples in the US. They do serve an important religious function. However, it seems to me these temples could also serve as centers for exposing Indian American children to India's rich heritage, for instance, in music and mathematics. We could also consider establishing a voluntary mentorship program whereby Indian American youngsters can have access to mentors who can give them guidance and timely help. What are your suggestions along these lines?
I have never lived in the US myself, have only been there only on numerous official visits or as a tourist. And so my knowledge and experience in this area is rather limited. Certainly temples and other religious places can, and to an extent do, I believe, serve as socio-cultural educational centers. And because of the generous funding and wide participation, can definitely widen their area of activity to attract more younger people.
Thank you, Mr. Basu, for a comprehensive look at the Indian diaspora in the United States and for your suggestions on how we can sustain the continued growth of Indian Americans. A big thank you to our listeners as well. Hope this episode will inspire you to consciously address problems of unconscious bias and come up with viable solutions. Please put Kamala Harris and the Rise of Indian Americans on your to-read list and please recommend it to your friends and family. This book is bound to be a great source of inspiration for the Indian diaspora. Thank you for your continued support.
Thank you, Dr. Lilly, for inviting me to participate in this Global India podcast. I'd also like to thank your listeners and would be happy to have their feedback after they've read the book. Thank you again.
We conclude this episode with a touch of class rendered by Indian classical music and some homespun humor. Right after Kamala Harris was nominated to the VP slot by Biden, there was a flurry of jokes making the rounds in social media, like the White House getting renamed as Kamala Nivas. There was also a joke about idli and dosa potentially becoming American national dishes. There were more jokes after the Biden-Harris victory, including a comment, why settle for vice president? Why not get to be the actual president? Reflecting the attitude of Indian tiger moms.